Hi, I wanted to welcome everyone to this webinar on screening. The webinar is one in a series of webinars focused on the essential components of response to intervention. My name is Amy Peterson and I help to provide technical assistance and support for the Center. In this webinar, I will be providing an overview of universal screening, why screening is important, and how to use screening data to make database decisions. I want to begin by sharing the definition for RTI that the National Center on Response to Intervention has developed. You will see in the first part of the definition, response to intervention integrates assessment and intervention within a school-wide, multi-level prevention system to maximize student achievement and reduce behavior problems. It is important to point out that RTI is a school-wide prevention system as opposed to a pre-referral for special education, and that it's a multi-level system as opposed to a multi-tier. It's important to understand that there are 3 levels of instruction in an RTI framework, and that districts, schools, and states can have multiple tiers within those 3 levels of instruction in order to prevent school failure. The second part of the definition highlights the essential components of the RTI framework. This includes screening, progress monitoring, multi-level prevention system, and database decision-making. In summary, RTI is a preventive framework. As mentioned before, RTI is not the new name for a pre-referral process. The intent of RTI is to improve outcomes for all students, while providing immediate supplemental supports to students at risk for poor learning outcomes. RTI may be a component of a comprehensive evaluation for SLD determination, but is not why we implement RTI. How RTI is used in the SLD eligibility process is determined individually by each state.
So as you saw in the definition, the Center has identified 4 essential components for RTI. Screening, or a system for identifying students at risk for school failure, is the focus of this webinar. The second component, progress monitoring, is a system for monitoring the effectiveness of the supports provided to students.
Third component, the multi-level prevention system, relates to providing evidence-based interventions based on student responsiveness. It's not merely the delivery of interventions, but that there is a multi-level prevention system in which students have access to increasingly intense levels of instruction and intervention. The primary level is the core curriculum and instruction. The secondary level is an addition to the primary and provides supports targeted to student needs. The tertiary is also supplemental to primary, but provides more intense interventions and supports than the secondary. Fourth component is database decision-making. This component involves the use of data, including screening and progress monitoring data, to adjust the intensity and nature of the interventions based on student responsiveness. In other words, there is an explicit systematic process for database decision-making. These data decisions can include decisions based on instruction, movement between levels, and disability identification. The Center has developed a graphic to highlight the framework. Many of you are probably familiar with the red, green, and yellow triangle for RTI. In reality, the triangle does not represent the RTI framework. It only represents the multi-level prevention component. The center graphic takes into account all of the essential components, most importantly, the use of data to make decisions, which is often absent from the traditional RTI triangle. If you look at the far left, you see screening. At the far right, you see progress monitoring. And at the bottom, the multi-level prevention system. 3 outer components require and are an essential part of the database decision-making process, which is why the arrows travel both directions. If these components are in place but database decision-making is absent, then RTI is technically not being implemented. If you look in the center ring, you will see culturally responsive, meaning that screening tools, progress monitoring tools, interventions, and database decision-making procedures are culturally responsive. In the same ring, you will notice evidence-based, implying that all components are evidence-based. If these components are implemented through a cohesive model, we would expect to see improved student outcomes. In this webinar, we're going to focus specifically on the screening component. In thinking about screening, we first need to think about different kinds of assessments that can be used in schools. There are 3 types of assessments that can be used in schools. Summative assessments are assessments of learning and occur after a student has learned something. Summative assessments are a form of evaluation used to describe the effectiveness of an instruction program or intervention. That is, whether the intervention has desired effects. Examples include end-of-chapter tests or final exams, high-stake tests, the GRE, SAT, and ACT. Second type of assessment is a diagnostic assessment. These are used to identify skill deficits that occur before learning. Diagnostic assessments can tell you what to teach and help to identify interventions. Examples are the qualitative reading inventory, the diagnostic reading assessment, key math, and running records with error analysis. These tests are typically time-consuming to administer and provide detailed individual information for students. The third type of assessment, formative assessment, are assessments for learning and occur during the learning process. With formative assessments, students' progress is systematically assessed to provide continuous feedback to both the students and the teachers concerning learning successes and failures. Formative assessments can be used to identify students who are not responding to instruction or interventions, for example, screening, and to understand rates of student improvement, for example, progress monitoring. These assessments are brief, reliable, and valid. An example is a CBM. For screening, we will be focused only on formative assessments. We are going to briefly go over the purpose, focus, tools, and time frame for screening, and we'll expand on each in the following slides. The purpose of screening is to identify those students who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. The focus is on all students, not just those students the teachers believe are at risk. Remember, this is not a diagnostic test. It's a brief, reliable, and valid assessment used to identify which students may need additional assessments, such as progress monitoring or diagnostic assessments, or additional instructional support. The tool should demonstrate diagnostic accuracy for predicting learning or behavioral outcomes. In other words, it should be able to accurately identify who could be at risk to the greatest extent possible. At a minimum, screening should occur at least more than one time per year, for example, once at the beginning and then again in the middle of the school year. However, we highly recommend conducting screening at least 3 times during the year, in the fall, winter, and spring, in order to use that data to evaluate program effectiveness, establish local norms and cut scores, and provide data for next year's teachers. The screening process is not unique to education. In fact, standardized screening processes are common in many other fields. In all cases, the purpose is to identify indicators that predict if more testing or further intervention is needed. Let's consider the 3 examples shown in the slides. For example, in the first picture, how many of you have had your blood pressure screened regularly or have participated in cancer screenings? Neither of these indicated if high or low blood pressure or cancer was present. Instead, the results of these cost-efficient and brief assessments indicated that there was some indication that they might be present. Additional follow-up is necessary to confirm or disconfirm this. In the second picture, think about the regular screening you conduct on your car. How many of you get a regular oil change? During the oil change, there is typically a 17 or 21-point courtesy check. Aside from regular maintenance, the screening checks are designed to identify issues that may make the car at risk for more expensive problems later on, for example, leaks or worn brake pads. Although the car functions okay now, it is likely to experience issues in the future. We perform these checks for preventative purposes. All of us have had eye exams, probably beginning in school. This very cheap screening process provides school nurses with sufficient data to refer a child for further assessment. Without this type of standardized eye screening in schools, many children may not have received appropriate vision supports until much later in their schooling. This could have a negative impact on learning and participation in other school activities. Many schools have also have similar checks for hearing and scoliosis. All 3 of these examples use screening to identify and address problems early in order to prevent bigger problems in the future. The same process applies in learning environments. The purpose of screening is to identify those students who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. Since RTI is a framework for providing services, the outcomes could be just about anything: academic achievement, mental and physical health, speech and language, behavior, graduation, post-school outcomes. Sites typically identify what outcomes students are expected to achieve and then screen to see which students are not likely to achieve those outcomes. For example, if the outcome is graduation, a quick screen of attendance and credits, predictors of graduation, can reveal which students are not likely to meet the requirements of graduation and need additional support. In another example, if the outcome is to demonstrate mastery on the end-of-year test, student performance on a curriculum-based measure, a predictor of academic achievement, can reveal which students are not likely to pass the test and need additional support. In addition to identifying those at risk for poor learning outcomes and those who need additional assessment and intervention, screening data can also help to answer key questions about the health of the school, the curriculum and instruction, and students. Lastly, screening data can be used as part of the SLD determination process to demonstrate that appropriate instruction was provided in the core instructional setting prior to referral. You can see how individual student performance compares to class performance in order to determine if struggling is due primarily to ineffective instruction. If the majority of the class is benefiting, but the individual is not, it may suggest that the student is not responding despite effective instruction. On the other hand, if most students are not benefiting and an individual student is struggling, it may be an indication that the student, along with his peers, have not received appropriate instruction. A focus then should be on improving core instruction, not providing individualized intervention. The focus on screening should be for all students. Although our assumptions about many students are correct, there are students who may still slip through the cracks unless there is an unbiased, systematic process for screening. Regular screening is necessary throughout the year for all in order to catch students who may have been doing well at the beginning but are struggling as the demands increase. Struggling students are identified by implementing a two-stage screening process. The first stage, universal screening, is a brief assessment for all students, conducted at the beginning of the school year. However, some schools and districts use it 2 to 3 times throughout the school year. For students who score below the cut point on the universal screen, a second stage of screening is then conducted to more accurately predict which students are truly at risk for poor learning outcomes. This second stage involves additional, more in-depth testing or short-term progress monitoring to confirm a student's at-risk status. Screening tools must be reliable, valid, and demonstrate diagnostic accuracy for predicting which students will develop learning or behavioral difficulties. Screening should be focused on educationally valid outcomes. What is screened should be based on the needs and goals of the school. Schools typically screen in reading, math, and behavior, but may also consider screening in other areas because of needs. This may include language, writing, physical, or mental health. The screening tool selected should be age-appropriate and capture student ability. No one screener can screen for all areas. Different screeners may be necessary for different outcome areas. Since we are interested in predicting to an outcome, general outcome measures are typically used as screeners. The Center has developed a screening tools chart that provides examples of a number of different types of tools. The tools chart can be accessed through the National Center on RTI's website at www.rti4success.org. The columns on the tools charts are indicators of valid tools and efficiency factors to consider. You will notice in several of the columns circles filled completely, partially, or not at all. The tools chart does not recommend tools, but provides users with a consumer report, similar to what you might find when searching for a car. There are many screening tools available, and all are not listed on the screening tools chart. Only tools that have been submitted by a tool vendor appear on the chart. When selecting a tool, it is important to consider both the technical rigor of the tool as well as your needs and priorities. To learn more about selecting the appropriate screening tool, watch the Selecting Evidence-Based Tools and Programs for Implementing Response to Intervention webinar that can be found on the National Center's website. Here's an example of a screener. This is the student copy of the CBM Passage Reading Fluency. This copy is placed in front of the student. Students are then provided with standardized directions and asked to read aloud for 1 minute. The teacher scores the probe for words read correct. The total words read correctly in 1 minute is considered the score for the passage. To get an accurate score for CBM for reading, at each screening period, students read 3 1-minute passages, and the median or the middle score is recorded. In thinking about timing for screening, it is important to consider how frequently screening will occur, when screening will occur, and how long it takes to screen. Additional time considerations may include the time for scoring and the time for conducting data analysis. Schools and districts must consider how frequently they will screen students. Screening students 1 time during the year is not effective. To ensure that screening data can provide an accurate representation of student-level knowledge, screeners should be conducted at least twice during the year, once at the beginning and once in the middle. As mentioned before, NCRTI recommends that screening should be conducted at least 3 times during the year, once at the beginning of the year, once in the middle, and once at the end. Screening 3 times is necessary to evaluate program effectiveness, establish local norms and cut scores, and provide data to the following year teacher. To ensure that screening occurs consistently and constantly throughout the year, schools and districts should schedule screening and screening data review into the calendar before the school year begins. Screeners must target skills pertinent to the grade and time that the screen is administered. For example, with reading, in kindergarten, the relevant skills could include phonemic awareness, letter and sound knowledge, and vocabulary. In first grade, it might be phonemic spelling, decoding, word identification, and text reading. In second and third grade, the measures could assess the number and type of words the student can read and comprehend, and the fluency of those skills. In higher grades, comprehension of more difficult tests may be the relevant skill. While screeners are by definition brief, schools and districts should determine the most efficient and effective way to screen students, since time-taking assessments takes away from time for instruction. Some screeners are provided individually. These are typically shorter, ranging from about 1 to 5 minutes in length. Some screeners are provided to the whole class at one time. These tend to be slightly longer, typically ranging from about 3 to 60 minutes, but may in fact be more time effective for teachers in larger classes compared to the individualized administration. RTI's success depends on the accurate identification of students as at risk. Perfect screening would result in 100% accurate identification of true positives, or those who need additional support, and true negatives, those who do not need additional support. Unfortunately, tests are not 100% accurate at classifying students based on risk. A cut score is used as a best guess based on existing data of who may or may not be at risk. However, other factors may lead to over-identification or under-identification of students. For example, a student was sick on the day of the test, or a student is a word caller but lacks comprehension. Because of the many factors that can influence student outcomes, screening tools tend to over-identify students as at risk. This is to combat costly misidentification of students. Progress monitoring and other follow-up assessments can help to refine the accuracy of the classification. The establishment of logical cut point is essential for accurately identifying students for additional assessments and supports and evaluating the effectiveness of the support system, because the choice of the cut score can influence the classification accuracy. Schools and districts can define cut scores in a variety of ways, including using national targets, for example from tools such as AimsWeb or DIBELS, using local norms, or using targets based on the likelihood of demonstrating mastery on core testing. Screening data can be used to make decisions at the state, district, school, and grade level. States can use RTI data to establish policy and guidance and to allocate resources. Districts can use data to evaluate the effectiveness of RTI, to establish policy and procedures, and to allocate resources. Schools can use the data to evaluate the effectiveness of the overall framework and essential components, to assess the alignment among grade levels, and to allocate resources. Grade level teams can use the data to evaluate the core curriculum and instruction, to identify students for secondary and tertiary instruction. Ranking students to determine which students need additional support, disaggregating students to see if there are differences in responses based on subgroups, and looking at trends across classes, grades, and schools can help to inform these decisions. Throughout the data analysis and decision-making process, data teams should include opportunities for team members to discuss and brainstorm why they may see certain patterns or trends, set goals, and to evaluate their progress. Regardless of the cut score that is used, the target identification rate is the proportion of the students to be identified as at risk. This proportion may be dependent on the program's objectives and available resources. For example, if the majority of the students are below the cut score, it may not be feasible or financially possible to serve all of those students in secondary or tertiary prevention levels. Instead, if more than 20% of the student population is identified as at risk, the focus should be on improving core curriculum and instruction. As was mentioned earlier, schools and districts often screen for multiple outcome measures. Unique target identification rates may be identified for different skill areas. For example, a school may have a larger target identification rate for word reading than for comprehension due to resource availability. As you can see in this graphic, School 1 has more resources available than School 2. Because of this, School 1 has enough resources available to serve 20% of their students in secondary or tertiary prevention levels. In contrast, School 2 only has enough resources available to serve 15% of students through secondary or tertiary prevention. This means students, even those with similar cut scores, may not be provided similar supports. After thinking about why you would use screening, what you would need to consider, and how screening can inform database decisions, it is also important to consider how screening fits into implementation and what you need to think about while implementing the RTI framework. It is often easy to identify your model's components, but implementing can be quite difficult and can take at least 2 to 4 years to get into full implementation. We recommend that you select and implement evidence-based practices and procedures. The tools chart, including the screening tools chart, provided by the National Center, can help you to do that. You should also implement the essential components and identified framework with integrity. It's not enough to implement screening and progress monitoring with integrity. You also must ensure that interventions, core curriculum and instruction, and database decision-making procedures are implemented with integrity. In addition, it's important to ensure that cultural and linguistic and socioeconomic factors are reflected in the RTI framework and its components. This may include awareness of potential differences between classroom culture and student background, awareness of student strengths that can be used to increase teaching effectiveness, awareness of how differences affect implementation of interventions and results of assessments, awareness of cultural and linguistic issues when working with parents. On the tools chart, there is a column that provides information about how these particular tools have been used with different groups. District and school teams should continually evaluate the efficacy of the model and the model's components for diverse populations. For more information, visit the National Center on Response to Interventions website at www.rti4success.org. You can also see the National Center's screening tools chart on the website. Please email any questions that you might have to rtiwebinars@air.org. We will be having a live chat on November 18th from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time to answer any questions submitted by email, as well as any additional questions that come up during the online chat.